Good evening and welcome to Medyascope. Today we have an exclusive interview with Gabriel Rockhill, French-American philosopher, whose article has been published on Medyascope website very recently. Hello, Professor Rockhill.
Hello.
Thank you very much for joining us. For those who do not know you, you are Associate Professor of Philosophy at Villanova University and Director of the Critical Theory Workshop at the Sorbonne in Paris. So, I want to begin with the question. Your article has got too much attention in Turkey. It's been read by more than 12,000 people on Medyascope's website. The article's main theme is the power of the Intelligentsia in general and the CIA's involvement in the French cultural environment during the Cold War in particular. So first of all, what is your main academic interests and main publications? And the second question, I saw the English and French versions of your article. Did it get as much attention as it did in Turkey?
Well, thank you very much. I have broad philosophic interests, but my research over the last decade or two has mainly focused on the relationship between culture and politics, with a particular attention to the historical narratives that are used and sometimes abused in order to relate them to one another. And so this most recent article came out of the research that I was doing for my book, Radical History and the Politics of Art. And one of the chapters in this book concentrates on the extent to which there were covert operations and primarily kind of financial meddling and institutional and material meddling that undergirded the development of post-war American art and the promotion of American culture around the world as part of a kind of global program of psychological warfare. I came across the document that was released that's from 1985 that details the extent to which there were operatives in Paris who were reading French theorists and preparing a report on them. And it immediately plugged into my broader concerns regarding the history of the 20th century and battles over culture and politics, and more specifically, the extent to which culture is not somehow just a supplement to politics, but is actually in the very forefront of a lot of the struggles, particularly in the context of the 20th century, in the latter half of the 20th century, and what's referred to as a kind of American hegemony, which often uses the sugar-coated pill of culture, backed up, of course, by bullets. But if the sugar-coated pill can pass, then it is a much more fluid and seamless way of establishing and maintaining global hegemony. Regarding the prominence or the circulation of the article, I myself was also quite surprised. Part of this was due to the kind of insightful recommendations of Jennifer Ponce de Leon, who helped to work with me in turning what was originally a kind of summary of the document into an article that looks to frame this particular document from 1985 in a broader context. And so it very quickly became one of the most widely read articles on the platform, the Philosophical Salon, and then was translated into Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, French, perhaps other languages. So yes, it has circulated more widely than I had anticipated. Mm-hmm.
Before going into the details of your article, I want to ask a basic question about critical reading, because you know, in internet you can find many conspiracy theories about the CIA and other institutions, other people. So how to distinguish your article from these conspiracy theories, and which tools can we use to distinguish this kind of text?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I think it's crucially important because the reference to conspiracy theory is precisely symptomatic of the extent to which certain modes of psychological warfare, and I use that vocabulary because it's the vocabulary of the Secret Service, has been successful. Meaning that it is indicative that as soon as one talks of government meddling or the role of the Secret Service behind the scenes, one of the flashpoints and buzzwords is immediately conspiracy theory. And I think that we should begin by questioning this intuitive and reflexive impulse and wonder where it comes from. Because there are primarily two types of people who rely on this vocabulary. The first are the merchants of doubt. These are the spin doctors who are focused precisely on delegitimating and marginalizing any systemic and substantial critique of what it is that they're doing. And the way in which they go about that is killing the messenger, so that there's a focus on the theorist who purportedly is imagining a conspiracy, rather than actually engaging with the material itself, looking at the evidence, and then drawing conclusions. The other group of people that tends to react in this way are those who have no substantial knowledge whatsoever regarding the details of the historical record, but who have been so conditioned by the spin doctors who are the merchants of doubt to react intuitively that they immediately fall or latch on to this buzzword without actually thinking through what it is that's being presented at an evidential level. And so I think that the most important thing is to look precisely at the documents that have been released by the CIA itself, the internal testimony of former and current members of the CIA, and the scholars and specialists who have spent years scouring over the archive and analyzing the details of what exactly has gone on. In this sense, if we take this approach, then I think it would be helpful to distinguish between conspiracy theory and conspiracy reality. A conspiracy theory, and I would say that this is the most important conspiracy theory of the last 70 years or so, consists in something like the following: that the United States government and its Secret Service has systematically been the greatest purveyor of democracy and freedom around the world by benevolently working with the masses to alleviate them from their kind of backward realities and bring them up to speed. I mean, it's a contemporary colonial narrative. Now, this is a conspiracy, and anyone who actually knows the evidential record clearly recognizes that this is a conspiracy theory, because of course the U.S. has been doing the exact opposite for at least since World War II, if we just take that as a starting point, insofar as that's when the CIA emerged after World War II. One of the ways in which we can reveal that is looking at the historical record and identifying the extent to which the U.S. government and the Secret Service has regularly lied to the public. The Gulf of Tonkin affair comes to mind with the Vietnam War, the intervention in Iraq, in which we were supposedly looking for weapons of mass destruction because Saddam Hussein was going to bizarrely work with an enemy or someone he was not clearly allied with, that is Al-Qaeda, in order to undertake attacks against the United States. That's a conspiracy. That's a conspiracy. There's a reality of a conspiracy that actually generates a theoretical framework, which is the opposite of that reality. In that sense, I think that what we need to do is scrutinize the record, not fall into particular buzzwords, and look at what we know and what we can reliably assert based on that knowledge pool and that archive.
Mm-hmm. So if you wish, we can go into details of the arguments that you present in your article. One of your main arguments was that CIA during the Cold War was not operating only physically, but it was also trying to shape the minds of people. And in order to support your argument, you present a CIA report which was prepared in 1985. For you, do you think that CIA was trying to understand what these new philosophers was doing, or were they actively trying to shape their philosophy for their own purposes?
Well, psychological operations undertaken by the CIA have many different dimensions to them, and they're often circumstantial and dependent on the particular context. One aspect of that is analysis, and it's very clear that the document that was published is the result of an ongoing attempt to map the intelligentsia in France, which was at the forefront of these cultural struggles, precisely because we can't forget contextually that the United States in World War II allied with the communist regime in the Soviet Union, and immediately at the close of World War II, if not slightly before for that matter, was trying to differentiate itself from communism and undertake a kind of cultural warfare against the more radical egalitarian left. In that sense, France was a crucial battleground because the internal resistance against the Nazi regime was, of course, headed by the communists. in this sense, the analysis was already related to a broader program, and that was trying to understand how the French intelligentsia, and more generally the Western European and the world intelligentsia for that matter, could be slightly nudged and sometimes forcefully nudged to the right. In order to do that, what they generally, the type of role that they played was based on a long leash policy. And when you think about it, it makes sense, particularly in the context of the post-World War II era, that the ideal situation is one in which you create material conditions that favor certain types of work, that provide enormous visibility and prominence for that work. And at the same time, those who are doing the work have the impression that they're simply expressing the ideas that they've always had. So in the document from 1985, there is no clear indication that the CIA was working directly with witting members of the intelligentsia, that Foucault was somehow a member of the CIA or something along these lines. But at the end of the document, there's a long bibliography of André Glucksmann and Bernard-Henri Lévy, who are the nouveau philosophes who are identified in the document as fighting the quote-unquote right fight, because they were fighting a fight against Marxism. In this regard, I would not be surprised at all. In fact, I think it would be quite cogent to learn that the CIA was working with the media, with journalists, in order to promote the type of work that the nouveau philosophes were doing. And let me just remind you quickly in this regard that the agency itself in 1973 conceded that it had placed some 36 operatives within major newspapers, and that a congressional inquiry conducted in 1976 concluded that the total was more like 50. And later, Carl Bernstein calculated that as many as 400 American journalists had worked for the CIA since 1952. So it's not, it would not be surprising at all. In fact, we know that in the post-World War II era, when Sartre and de Beauvoir took a trip through Germany in order to visit and explore the consequences and the ruins of World War II, that the CIA placed articles that were critical of them in major newspapers in order to delegitimate those like Sartre and de Beauvoir who were taking hard left positions. The New York Times actually provided at least 10 officers with cover as reporters and clerical staff at foreign bureaus. This has been documented. So in that regard, I think that we have to understand exactly how these types of operations function, and that their goal is to be covert and to facilitate the promotion of certain types of work. At times, particular members of the intelligentsia become witting. Gloria Steinem is a quite famous case because she wittingly worked for the Independent Service of Information, which was a CIA-financed student enterprise that was launched to so-called save the third world youth from the grips of communism. And Sidney Hook and James Burnham, who were both philosophy professors at NYU University, at New York University, were witting in their collaborations with the CIA, and they helped found the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So these operations function at different levels, and we have to always be attentive to both how they function and then what we can surmise logically from the archival record and what we can prove with the archival record.
So I want to ask a question about the scope of the efforts of the CIA. Because you focus on the French case, but I think it is not only limited to France, the CIA's efforts, and I think it is not also limited to the Cold War era, right? After the Cold War, do you think that CIA's efforts continue?
Of course. No, absolutely, and thank you for highlighting that. This article is about a specific instance. It is in the forefront insofar as French theory is a global theory. I mean, it's one of the most prominent kind of intellectual products of the latter half of the 20th century, so it's not surprising that the CIA would be interested in it, but we have to recognize the two things that you just highlighted. One is that this is a cultural war of international proportions, and that it's clearly ongoing. When you understand the kind of history of the CIA, because the CIA emerged from It came out of the OSS, that was the wartime information agency, and it developed right in the post-war era, and the people who founded it came straight from Wall Street. The way in which the CIA calls itself internally is the company, and I think this is very important terminology. The company clearly signals what the overall role of the CIA is, and that is to impose global capitalism on populations around the world at any cost whatsoever, in order to further the interests of, quote unquote, the company, which is neoliberal or economic capitalist hegemony. In this sense, we have a clear account of the extent to which the CIA has been meddling all over the world. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was set up and run, headquartered in Paris in the post-war era, had offices in some 35 countries. They published dozens of prestige magazines. They were involved with the book industry. They organized high-profile international conferences and art exhibits. They coordinated performances and contributed ample funding to various cultural endeavors and fellowships, as well as worked with a whole series of front organizations, the Farfield Foundation being first and foremost. And so we have to understand the scope of this. The final thing that I would say on this front is that at a certain level, this makes sense at a very crude level, because capitalism is pernicious to life on planet Earth. It is violent to most people most of the time, and it's destroying the biosphere. And if you have a company that can work covertly in order to impose a system that most people around the world do not want, then that company will need to work 24/7 and constantly impose this agenda because it's not something that would be intuitively or spontaneously accepted. I'm thinking here of the work of Karl Polanyi on the history of the emergence of so-called laissez-faire economics.
Before moving to the conclusions that you reached in your article, I want to talk about some criticisms that you have received from Turkey. Maybe you want to respond to these criticisms, because certain people have argued that these kinds of articles would create a kind of suspicion among scholars, and one can easily accuse someone who belongs to the research program initiated by Foucault of serving to the interests of the USA or CIA. How would you respond to these kinds of criticisms?
Well, I would say that we have to be very careful about how politics operates and make sure that we don't establish facile one-to-one correlations. I don't think that working on a particular figure or group of individuals necessarily at some symbolic level gives you the right to a particular politics. I think that that's a consumer model of intellectual work, meaning that you buy into a particular tradition and therefore you're given in return a particular politics. What this means is, for me, that we have to avoid any kind of golden calves and look precisely at how particular intellectuals operated within a specific political and historical context. In the case of someone like Foucault, who is pinpointed in the document for being the most prominent intellectual in France, and they celebrate the fact that he was critical, and this is true because he claims this very clearly, particularly in the later writings around 1984, that he was critical of global, or I'm sorry, I mean, the word that he uses in French is global, but large-scale social movements that attempt to reconfigure the socio-political order. He was also, for that matter, extremely Eurocentric in his endeavors. He was critical of the feminist movement and the gay rights movement. He was not actively engaged in the early part of his life in politics, and he says this himself. He says that he was a kind of non-active rebel, not a revolutionary who was in the streets. And so I think that instead of getting into defending golden calves of the academy, what we should do is just look concretely at what people have done, how they've aligned themselves with particular movements or not, and then also think about how we act as members of the intelligentsia and what our politics are, instead of hiding behind, particular kind of figures or movements with symbolic value. The last thing that I'd say in this regard, and this is in part because I myself did my dissertation in France, I worked with some of the leading luminaries in so-called French theory, is that there's a particular image of French theory, primarily in the Anglophone world, but kind of the ramifications for that end up usually being more global, in which the French theory of the 60s and 70s has this radical chic veneer. And if we look concretely at some of what these figures were doing in their own political alignments, many of them were backtracking from hard leftist politics of the people that they had studied under or the prior generation. So people like Sartre, Barthes, de Beauvoir, Fanon, of course, and others had a hard left politics. By the time you get to people like Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze is a bit of a separate issue. There's a backtracking from those types of political engagements. And the CIA was tracking this, and they were very interested in the ways in which the intelligentsia was no longer being as resolutely and publicly critical of U.S. imperialism. And that, I think, is clearly the case. And I agree with Edward Said's critique of Foucault for not paying enough attention to U.S.-style imperialism and regularly being critical of it.
Mm-hmm. So let's come to the conclusions that you drove in your article. You criticize the education system which is imposed by the neoliberal policies, and you say that it is reducing the education to the vocational training, and which creates passive masses. So what is your idea about education? So which policies should we implement in order to create people, individuals who have certain tools that would serve to criticize the current situation in society?
Well, I think we have to recognize that the universities are not ivory towers. They are very powerful institutions that are part of a larger matrix of power. And that matrix of power has functioned largely in the period that I'm talking about, from World War II to the present, in order to police ideas and to make sure that there are material conditions available for certain types of work and not for other types of work. And so the evolution of the U.S. university goes hand in hand with the agenda of the company. This is one of the reasons they infiltrated student movements. They were on campus. They were very concerned with the extent to which campuses could be hotbeds for radical leftist politics. And so when you look at the contemporary era, one thing, and I'll just take the U.S. as an example in this regard, that is important, is that through the Red Scare and the purging of the university and the transformation of the university over time, and I would say that it's always been there in certain regards, but it's been intensified, into a vocational training ground for cogs in the capitalist system, that this long-term project is precisely one that is aimed at killing a critical intelligentsia. In that regard, I think that what we need to do is not only think in individualist terms and prop up particular kind of divas of leftism or take on a kind of radical veneer in relationship to rhetoric or symbols, but instead think collectively about what it means to produce a cultural left that would have the power to contest and rival the power of the right-drifting institutions that we have. What that means is that the work really needs to be collective and it needs to be material. There needs to be the forging of alternative institutions. And in fact, there already is, of course, the forging of alternative institutions. I've been involved with that myself. I know a number of them that are extremely important. There need to be different platforms for the circulation of work. There needs to be modes of guerrilla education in which education is not simply confined within particular institutionalized settings. And again, these are all things that I'm concretely invested in and involved with myself, and many others are. There needs to be more public intellectual work, activism that is engaged in organizing communities for collective transformation of society and politics. And in that sense, we have to, I think, recognize the extent to which the work to be done is already going on and needs to be furthered by creating the institutional and material matrix that favors a cultural left.
So I want to conclude with the intellectuals' responsibility during these hard times. I'm saying hard times because, you know, we have been observing the rise of the right-wing populist politics during the last decades, especially with Trump in the US, and its devastating impact of so-called post-truth reasoning. So, for you, what is the responsibility of an intellectual during these hard times?
I would say two things. One is that we have to recognize that these hard times are the result of decades and decades of resolute material struggle on the part of the right wing. And by right wing, I mean the capitalist establishment. And I would include, for instance, the Democratic Party within the United States within the right wing, and be clear about what left-wing politics means. Left-wing politics means anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, ecological, autonomous politics. In that regard, these are the consequences of systemic changes. And this is, I think, extremely important because otherwise we only see the most recent developments in terms of a kind of flash in the pan, or we get obsessed with particular personalities, denigrating those personalities for being clownish and whatnot. We have to understand the contemporary moment as the result of deep historical, systemic changes that are largely the result of an ongoing assault on the part of the pro-capitalist imperialist right. In that regard, the role of the intellectual, as you say today, I would say is one of being an interventionist intellectual, as opposed to the kind of total intellectual that is affiliated with the work of Sartre, where you make kind of universal claims to the true nature of the world and the unfolding history, or the specific intellectual that was praised by or promoted by someone like Foucault and Deleuze as working within the interstices of power matrices in order to map them, but not necessarily laying claim to a broader politics of radical social transformation. An interventionist intellectual is someone who recognizes that one's own theoretical practice, what you do in the world, is part of a political struggle and a material struggle, and someone who takes responsibility for that by producing not simply intellectual work, but material networks that facilitate different modes of production. And this is one of the reasons that I thought it was quite interesting that you reached out to me for this interview, because what I understand about your own media platform, and again, this is from the outside, but I'm a big supporter of alternative media because it is precisely a material platform for the circulation of ideas that is not directly beholden to the imperatives of the contemporary demagogues who are in the front lines of defending the capitalist assault on humanity in the world.
Professor Rockhill, thank you very much for this fruitful discussion.
Thank you.
So today we have talked with Professor Rockhill about his recent article, which has also been published on the Medyascope website. Thank you for joining us. Have a nice day.
Thank you.